So the agenda today was to look at, first of all, sustainability in the Olympics. So the broad concepts of sustainability and what it might mean for the Olympics. And then I wanted to drill down into an assessment of climate positive obligations for Brisbane 2032. And I've looked at an assessment evaluating sustainability of the two levers basically that can achieve climate positive for the Olympic Games in Brisbane. And the third part is, yeah, just thinking about the concepts of assessment of legacy. So, as I said, I'm very interested in thinking about the Olympics, and this is obviously well known in the International Olympic Committee, and everyone knows that Olympics can leave legacy, hopefully positive legacy. But how do we assess legacy is an interesting area that I'm quite interested in sort of further research on. So I think that last bit probably might be a bit more interactive. We can have a bit more discussion about some concepts and ideas around that. So first of all, sustainability in the Olympics. Another nice slide. This is of the Gold Coast, which is a city just south of Brisbane, one of the three sites for three centres for Brisbane 2032 Olympics. But I guess, yeah, just when we think about the carbon footprint of the Olympics, we look back over time, we can see that the carbon emissions are made up of a combination of construction emissions, emissions for operations, and emissions for spectators. And spectators, we're talking about air travel and hotels accommodation and associated emissions with spectators coming to an Olympic Games. And I guess just to illustrate this in detail, we can see here in the middle here, Rio de Janeiro, very high spectator emissions, and that's because of the geographical nature, location of Rio, relying on air travel for people to get to the city, and then construction emissions. So yeah, a fair few new construction of stadia being built for Rio. And operation, the green color there, just the actual running of the games. And then you can see the other thing, I guess, that you can see since actually Beijing in 2008, these are obviously just mostly, oh, well, they include Winter Olympics and Summer Olympics, but the biggest emitters are the Summer Olympics. You can see since Beijing 2008, the Summer Olympics there, that there have been the use of carbon offsets, some sort of mitigation measure to effectively compensate for the emissions from construction, operation, and spectators. So I guess another thing to just note here is the for Tokyo, in fact, most of these Olympics now will have a pre-games sustainability report and a post-games sustainability report. So for Tokyo, we can see the pre-game sustainability report had a number here for spectator emissions, and then obviously that was run in 2021 with basically no spectators. So you can see the very fine sliver of red there for the spectator emissions from Tokyo, and a lot of extra carbon offsets that were done for Tokyo as well. Similarly, for Beijing, we can see a pre-games report of what's been looked at for Beijing, and post-games is the actual emissions from Beijing. So much smaller carbon footprint and also smaller offsets. For Paris, I haven't got the post-games emissions information yet because the sustainability report hasn't been released. But the pre-game sustainability report certainly had Paris sort of confining itself to about 2 million tons of carbon dioxide for the event. And that's a significant amount, I guess. Just putting it in the context, that is the same as the annual emissions of a small country like Malta or the Bahamas over a whole year is emitted for the Olympic Games and Paralympic Games are, essentially a 4 week event. So there are these pressures, I guess, on the Olympics when we start to scrutinize where the carbon emissions are coming from. And yeah, I guess because of this carbon footprint, there are some pressures on the Olympics. So, some actually fundamental questions being asked. So, are the Olympics even compatible with, our focus on sustainability? It does the concept of flying everyone, a lot of spectators, millions of spectators to sporting festivals. Does that make sense in this, sustainability focused world? And there's been a few different models being put forward, decentralized model that distributes the hosting burden over a number of countries, like the FIFA World Cup. But even the FIFA World Cup comes into question that the World Cup that's coming up soon will be over 3 continents: South America, Morocco in Africa, and Spain, Portugal in Europe. So, there's still a significant amount of air travel, even though there's a distributed model there in the FIFA World Cup. Other scholars like Muller at University of Lucerne have talked about the idea of rotating the Olympics around just 3 or 4 cities that have appropriate infrastructure in place. But I think as a bit of an Olympics fan myself, I guess I have a little bit of bias to the Olympics. I certainly enjoy the Olympics and like the Olympics and kind of believe in the Olympics, I guess, if it comes to that. I do think the Olympics and the IOC makes this point that the Olympics really is a very powerful gathering of countries, people from all over the world. And we can see that there's a really strong value in the concept of the Olympic and Paralympic Games when we're confronted with such a fractious world with lots of tension and wars and deep issues around the world. So I do believe in the Olympics as an important part of trying to generate world peace and action. I guess in response to the pressures around the Olympics and the idea of, there's been some scandals, there's been some overinvestment in infrastructure leading to white elephants of infrastructure, and this high footprint of the Olympics, the high carbon footprint of the Olympics. Olympic Agenda 2020 set out what the Olympics calls the new norm, the new way of kind of hosting the Olympics, of bidding and hosting Olympic Games. And this is all about, increasing the value in terms, particularly for host cities, in terms of being flexible, being a partner in hosting the Olympics, and also having a really strong focus on sustainability. And the idea with that is that also then the delivery costs and complexity and also waste and risk decrease as well. And I guess the new norm could be summarized as the concept of the host city, the Olympics fitting into the host city rather than the host city fitting into the Olympics. So it really means, using the host as it is, and making the Olympics work within those host regions. And we can see this in things like, and Paris is a great example of this, of Olympic villages, the athletes' villages that are, models of sustainability, and that will be turned into, public housing afterwards. Transportation, very much focused on public transportation, and the idea of venue sharing. I think in the past there were often requirements from International Olympic Committee for each sport to have its own particular venue, whereas now there's a concept of venue sharing, and certainly for the venues to be reused after the Olympics. So no sort of white elephant infrastructure just for the use of one sport during 2 or 4 weeks of sport. So that's a little bit of a background of sustainability and how it fits in with the Olympics. I'll turn now to Brisbane 2032 and this concept of climate positive, and I'll introduce the sustainability assessment that I've done for that for the commitments for delivering Brisbane 2032. So just as an overview of Brisbane, I mean, when you think about previous host cities, especially in recent times, you've got London and Beijing and Rio and Los Angeles and Paris. I think it's fair to say that Brisbane is not at that same level of being a known city in the world. I would say it's definitely not an alpha world city. I would class it more as a beta world city. And interestingly, even though Brisbane might not be so well known to many of you, Brisbane I guess, is a very aspirational city. It's always had ambitions of hosting the Olympics, even back in the 1980s. It actually bid to host the 1992 Olympics. And it's had a series of very successful events, including World Expo in 1988, including the Goodwill Games, and also the Commonwealth Games, both in the city and in regional areas as well. So there is a strong ambition and strong public support for Brisbane hosting the Olympic Games. It is the first the first summer games that is awarded under this new norm. So the IOC's new norm is built into the contractual arrangement for hosting Brisbane 2032. And as part of this, it's really one of the first games that has a really regional approach. I know there was a regional approach on show for sure in Paris, with events in Marseille and Nice and even Tahiti as well. But Brisbane will have, I guess, a stronger model of regionalisation, even though the Games itself is still within, say, a 250-kilometre footprint. There will be 3 athletes' villages: the central athletes' village in Brisbane City itself, which is in the Brisbane zone in the middle there. There'll be an athletes' village in the Gold Coast zone in the south, and an athletes' village in the Sunshine Coast zone in the north. So Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, very beachside locations, very beautiful locations as well, catering for things like triathlon and open water swimming and mountain biking and those sort of events. They will have their own athletes' villages, but the vast majority of events will be in central Brisbane or surrounding Brisbane areas. Excuse me. So this regional approach really utilizes the strengths of the region. The Gold Coast region, the southern region there, hosted the Commonwealth Games in 2018. So a lot of infrastructure was put in place for the Commonwealth Games, which is going to be reused, obviously, for the Olympic Games. So even though it has got pretty good public support, I'd say very strong public support, there have been a few controversies, and maybe that's part of the idea of maybe that's a result of awarding these games 11 years before the Olympics are actually due to take place. So the Olympics was awarded to Brisbane through a dialogue process, a preferred host process, and then it was awarded 11 years in advance. And I think this has created possibly this is just a personal reflection, but kind of too much time to think about how to do things. And that long lead time is also not compatible with the electoral cycle of our governments as well. So there's some politicization of some aspects, particularly not of the concept as a whole, but more about where to put different stadia. Especially Brisbane needs a big new stadium, and there's reluctance to put that in Brisbane. I think mainly because there's not meant to, under the new norm, there's not meant to be many new stadiums. Actually, the bid document states that 85% of Brisbane is going to be used, 85% of the games will use existing stadia. So it's really not meant to have new stadium, but we know that our big stadium is actually at the end of its life. So there's lots of questions about, well, why not build a new stadium for the Olympics and for the future as well? So there's a little bit of controversy. Anyway, that's a nutshell of Brisbane. So quick note on what climate positive is. So climate positive is actually built, the term climate positive, even though you could argue it's a little bit of greenwashing, sure, but it is actually built into the host contract for Brisbane 2032. So whether it's talked about in great detail in marketing and communication is one thing, but there is a contractual obligation for Brisbane to be climate positive. And I guess in terms of the contract, it spells out that you've got kind of two ways of achieving climate positive, which is essentially net zero plus something extras, plus something additional. So there's two ways of achieving climate positive. It's one is through minimization of emissions through different reduction strategies. So if you think about a business as usual case, you will minimize emissions through doing different things, changing the electricity mix, building new public transport infrastructure, etc. Then you've got residual emissions that you can't get rid of. And we know that for Brisbane 2032, which is even more geographically isolated than Rio, that there's going to be a lot of residual emissions unless there's something very radical. But from our analysis, kind of a separate project that we've done here, there's not a lot on the horizon for 2032. Only in 8 years' time, sustainable aviation fuels will be part of the mix, but not a great part of the mix. And certainly things like electric aircraft and hydrogen aircraft won't be on the scene in 8 years' time. So we will have a large residual emissions from, despite our best efforts at minimizing emissions through different strategies. Our estimates are that these residual emissions, over half of the residual emissions will be from air travel. So that's a tough one for Brisbane to get out of. However, enter offsets, carbon offsets, which are collectively, I guess, called compensation mechanisms. Carbon offsets reduce or supplement those, compensate for those residual emissions with different techniques for carbon offsetting, notably in the case of Brisbane and Queensland through tree planting, and then there'll be more trees planted, more carbon offsets than are needed for residual emissions, such that it will be technically, well, according to the definition within the host contract, it will be climate positive. So it's contractually obliged to be climate positive. It won't be the first games to be climate positive because most Olympics now have more carbon offsets than residual emissions. So most of the games now are technically climate positive anyway, or let's say net zero anyway. But of course, carbon offsets come with their own baggage, I guess, their own issues. But yeah, just to emphasize this point, three mechanisms within the climate positive obligations within the host contract. So first, minimizing emissions as much as possible in line with the Paris Agreement. The second is offsetting more than 100% of the residual emissions, and these need to be through certified climate active carbon neutral mechanisms as part of a certified carbon neutral event. And then the third is to, and I guess this is an interesting one, influence and create change and deliver lasting climate benefits. So I kind of like this third one, even though it's quite fuzzy and woolly, because I think this is where maybe some real change, some behavioral change can be achieved. And yeah, as I said, with the offsets through plantations, forest plantations, which have their own issues in terms of additionality, in terms of permanence, and that sort of thing. So yeah, offsets are needed, but I think obviously an over-reliance on offsets is can be problematic. So moving on to then the assessment of the climate positive scenarios. So we looked at two assessment options, and two research questions really. So as I said, we've got these two levers. One is carbon offsets, and the other is actually reducing emissions in the first place. So how can they be evaluated was their first question. Like how can you kind of compare one with the other in terms of sustainability? And then specifically for Brisbane 2032, we looked at the combination of carbon offsets and emission reduction strategies that were likely to maximize sustainability. So the first research question is kind of scoring sustainability, and the second is about applying that scorecard to Brisbane 2032 to look at the strategies and the scenarios that maximize sustainability. So this all comes out of a paper that I wrote with a colleague of mine here at the University of Queensland, Prabhakaran Banaraja Ambath. So Prabha and I wrote this paper, and it's open access, so you're welcome to have a look at it at any time. And I guess importantly, we based our paper on Martin Muller et al.'s paper from the University of Lucerne. And in that paper, the authors, published in Nature Sustainability, the authors did an evaluation of the sustainability of the Olympic Games. So they looked at ecological, social, and economic dimensions of sustainability, and they looked at different indicators within those dimensions. And essentially, they gave a sustainability score to all of the Olympics, including Tokyo, actually, and included the Tokyo, I think it was the pre-games sustainability report for Tokyo. So essentially gave a gold, silver, and bronze medal to different editions of the past Olympics. And the top two Olympics were Winter Olympics, Salt Lake City and Albertville. Both of these cities scored highly in sustainability. And interestingly, Barcelona in 1992, which is quite a while ago now, got third place in terms of its sustainability credentials. So using that assessment model was really important for us. We had a model that had been used to evaluate previous Olympic Games, and we wanted to take that model and repurpose it, I guess, to look at the sustainability for different scenarios to achieve climate positive Olympics for Brisbane 2032. As I said, the sustainability model evaluates sustainability, the concept, from three dimensions. And I guess we can debate whether all three dimensions are equal, but I guess there is certainly a school of thought that ecological, social, and economic dimensions should all be weighted equally. And That was used in Muller's paper, so we kept that concept of the equal weightings of ecological, social, and economic dimensions. And then within each of those dimensions, we had to look at different indicators within those dimensions. So for ecological, we had things like resource management. We had two indicators in each of the dimensions: ecological, resource management, and land management. For public approval, for social, we had public approval and social equity. And for economic, we had the long-term viability and also the budget, how much it cost. And for each of those indicators, then, we also had to look at proxy variables that we would use to kind of weight and score those indicators. So for resource management, for example, we looked at the estimated CO2 emissions from the energy consumption. We looked at the land required for land management. For social equity, we looked at data on jobs created in these two levers, electricity and carbon. We also looked at public approvals. We had some indicators of public support through surveys. And then for economic, we had the costs for electricity and for the carbon offset units. And for long-term viability, we had a kind of an understanding of the after use of infrastructure, which is mainly focused on renewable electricity generation. From that model, that assessment model, we then trawled through. This was a couple of years ago now. Actually, there's not too much more publicly available information on Brisbane 2032 apart from bid documents, even now. So there was a feasibility study done. There was a few documents from the International Olympic Committee as part of the dialogue process, a feasibility assessment. There was a questionnaire, and then there was a questionnaire from the IOC, and then there was also a response to the questionnaire from the Brisbane and Queensland governments. So we looked at all of these as the main source documents. And then, interestingly or crucially, we created 3 scenarios for Brisbane, climate positive Brisbane 2032. So importantly, under each of these 3 scenarios, so scenarios are kind of, versions or visions of the future. So under each of these 3 scenarios, each of these scenarios achieve climate positive, okay? So that's important to know. Each of these scenarios achieves climate positive, but some achieve climate positive by using carbon offsets and relying on carbon offsets a lot more. And this scenario we called shot put. So basically kind of almost a status quo, nothing much changing from 2020, 2021. We had a javelin scenario, which was kind of the most ambitious scenario in decarbonisation of the system, which had less reliance on carbon offsets and more reliance on, actually the key part of the javelin scenario was a complete decarbonisation of the electricity system in Queensland, the state of Queensland. So 100% renewable energy used for games operations. And then we had a middle scenario, which we call the discus scenario, which was kind of a slightly more ambitious scenario than the status quo, and it covered off a few more ambitious electricity targets, like the 50% renewable electricity target that the Queensland government announced. So I hope you can kind of appreciate that 3 scenarios kind of looked at different aspects of different aspects or different weightings of decarbonisation of systems versus the use of offsets. And we created these scenarios and we looked at them particularly for each of the categories of emissions. So construction emissions, operation emissions, and spectators emissions. So for spectators emissions, we had a very lofty ambition in the javelin scenario for spectator emissions. So 100% renewable energy for spectator activities, zero emissions, public transport. We had a big reduction in air travel by the use of sustainable aviation fuel, but we kept international air travel as the current emissions profile. So you can see we kind of had these different scenarios with different levers for each of the categories. Okay, so I'm cutting straight to the results, which basically assessed each of those scenarios against the scorecard that I showed you beforehand and using those proxy variables. So the results indicate, first of all, that, and I guess it's kind of perhaps what we would expect, but also the fact that this assessment looked not just at the social and environmental dimensions of sustainability, but also looked at the economic dimensions of sustainability. So our least ambitious scenario, shot put, which was using basically an unchanged electricity mix and very modest targets for sustainability and emissions reduction, shot put actually had the lowest sustainability score. So it had the poorest sustainability outcomes, therefore. It scored highest on budget balance because actually it's the cheapest method, the cheapest scenario to implement because you just have to plant a lot of trees. But there's no deep efforts in decarbonisation, and there's also issues with land management and public approval as well. At the other end, the other extreme, Javelin actually had the highest decarbonisation outcome, the highest sustainability outcomes. Remember, Javelin scenario was a deep decarbonisation of electricity and transport systems, which had high costs, but had some really positive sustainability outcomes in terms of long-term viability, social equity, and scored obviously highly on resource and land management. And then our middle scenario, scored kind of in the middle with which still had, significant levels of compensation. So we calculated the level of compensation required under the DISCUS scenario and scored that accordingly. And it scored kind of middle of the road in terms of all of the carbon, all of these sustainability dimensions. So that's the sustainability assessment that we did for Brisbane 2032. I guess my real interest going forward is looking at legacy. So we've assessed sustainability, and hopefully that can influence a little bit some of the decision making around sustainability. But we are really focused on the games as a catalyst for change. About enhancing social, economic, and environmental outcomes. So under this concept of the new norm scenario, which is a more sustainable, low-cost delivery of the Olympic Games, there's more of a focus then on innovation and influencing behavior change potentially, perhaps less on infrastructure because you're not necessarily creating new stadiums and new special train lines, etc., but more focus on these longer lasting sustainable changes that can be part of society post games. So this is an interesting area to kind of, for me to think about, and I guess it's still a work in progress in terms of my thinking. And I guess in terms of legacy, a really interesting one for me is to think about, especially under this new norm idea of just delivering a games that the city can cope with, I guess, is that how do we scope what legacy is? Because legacy needs to be as a direct consequence of hosting the games. and it's not a business as usual. It's not a business as usual thing, something that would have been done anyway without the games. So the scoping area is a really interesting area for me to think about in terms of legacy. And I think, one of the ideas I'm starting to toy around, play around with in my mind is thinking about legacy assessment. So I presented to you the sustainability assessment model, which looked at sort of more short-term costs and benefits of hosting the games. But when we think about legacy assessment, we might think about a time horizon, maybe 10 years. And I choose 10 years because the legacy document for Brisbane 2032 is called Brisbane 2042. It talks about how Brisbane and the region should be seen when you're in 2042, looking back on the Olympics that occurred in 2032. So I guess thinking about a longer term legacy cost benefit scenario and thinking about a 10-year time horizon might be quite good. And one of the things that I'm also really interested in thinking about might be the concept of thinking about the greenhouse gas emissions that might be avoided through having legacy options in place. So again, a very conceptual idea at this stage about thinking about a life cycle assessment of Olympics, not just for the Olympics, but also post the Olympics, maybe in this 10-year window. So this is my last slide to wrap up, just to think about future research directions. So I think there's a lot of cool areas that we can think about in terms of the Olympics and how it shapes cities. So one is to think about the legacy and how we could think about and evaluate previous games against some sort of sustainability rating and the correlation of sustainability and legacy for mega events. I'm also interested in legacy assessment. So thinking about these models like scope 4 emissions, etc., that might think about sustainability across the dimensions, but over a time period post mega events, and thinking about the analysis of scoping and definitions, maybe with the International Olympic Committee and organising committees. And I think there's an opportunity to integrate with ICOS cities as well. I know that you have this polar application in urban landscape, so potentially there's a way to integrate Brisbane as a city observatory into that scheme to think about greenhouse gases and monitor greenhouse gases as a direct result of hosting a mega event. And then the final idea is looking at legacy and under the new norm. So how can what can be the legacy for new norm cities hosting the Olympics in terms of delivering role model narratives that can achieve sustainability outcomes? And are there opportunities to think about case studies as a potential to change behaviors, change individual perceptions of sustainability, and how that might lead to resultant legacies as well. So I hope I have gone okay on time, maybe a little bit too long, but thank you very much for your time, everyone. It's a real pleasure to talk to you, and I'm very happy to take some questions from the audience. Maybe there were some questions that came up. No questions in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much, and very happy to take some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. That was a fantastic talk. That is really, really nice. Well, I do have a question, but let's see if somebody else would chip in or has anything to say. You talked mainly about planting trees as a carbon offset, kind of. And while I'm not sure that would be enough, it is well, certainly one way of carbon offset as such. Um, is there any thought about more, let's say, engineering technical solutions, as in removing carbon from the air whatsoever? That would be one part. I know that is financially then, a different ball game, but it might be more effective in especially short term.
Hmm.
Is there anything thought of
Look,
as well in this direction?
yeah, thanks, Claudia, for the question. And I guess the short answer is not that I know of. There's not a lot of publicly available information about um, the types of offsets or the type of carbon compensation that would be used in Brisbane 2032. There's been some talk um, about forestry, the plantations. And I guess there's been talk about that in terms of potentially restoring ecosystems that have been degraded, particularly in some parts of Queensland, where there have been cattle grazing areas and sort of changing those over to more nature reserves that would then hold carbon in place for long periods of time. Um, I don't think there's been any discussion about technology like direct air capture or anything like that. I think the direction they're going in is probably more in this kind of nature-based solutions. And certainly I think
Okay.
it also provides an opportunity to think about the role of First Nations people in Australia and how they can be involved in these projects as well.
Thanks.
No worries.
And since I don't see a hand, well, I have another question. Um, so you have been talking about, electrifying, let's put it this way, like public transportation or, like doing a lot for within the city to go like more carbon neutral or in that direction. And I know from other cities, because I mean, obviously we have a background of cities here. I am always a little bit, how shall I say, uneasy. You mentioned the scope 1, 2, 3, 4, because if then the power plant is just far away, you burn a lot of coals to produce the electricity, and then the city is green. Um, it's Yeah, that makes me always a little bit uneasy to say, yeah, we have a green city now because we have electric cars and everything is public transportation, but then we just shifted basically the energy production out. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that's good question. I think generally, so the scope of, the supply chain for Brisbane as a city would include the state of Queensland. So it's but it is also on the national electricity grid, which is a grid on the east coast of Australia. The Queensland government, I guess, since this paper was published, Queensland government have committed to, and the great thing is that they're using 2032 as a key date because obviously it's a key date
Mm, okay.
in the city and the state's history. So the commitment from the current government, maybe there'll be a change of government, but the current government have a commitment for 70% renewable energy in the electricity system by 2032. So that's very good. And I guess that's
Nice.
very
Yeah.
you can see there that the kind of the push of the Olympics, with the eyes of the world on the Olympics on Brisbane, when they're hosting the Olympics, to be able to say, okay, well, actually, we've really decarbonized our electricity system. I think that has been a really um, a strong reason for, decarbonizing and choosing 2032 as a date.
Yeah. Thank you. Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you, Tony, for your nice presentation again. Yeah, hello. I'm really interested in your concept of legacy and also perhaps legacy as a push for behavior change. And my question is in this context of the new norm that you mentioned, what role do you think that the Olympics can play as an international role, for example, for sustainability, and how would you measure this in your studies as well?
Good question. I think the first question may be the first part of your question easier to understand answer than the second part. The measurement, I think, is very hard. But I think we can look to Paris 2024 to see some of the sort of little subtle changes in behavior that have occurred, or that have been tried to have attempted to be implemented. For example, the plant-based meals for spectators. I know that I think they were aiming for 60 or 70% plant-based meals to be served for spectators. I think that also somehow made its way into the athletes' village, which is probably not the best thing because maybe some athletes really like needing their protein and that sort of thing. But yeah, I think there's an example of plant-based diets being sort of quite deliberately but yet subtly introduced to a wider audience through the catering options for the Olympic Games. And I think similarly for things like air conditioning and that sort of thing. So I think there are some good examples. And I think Paris has had a laser focus on implementing sustainability measures as part of the delivery of the games. How that's measured is a bit more difficult. And I think, obviously there can be some great achievements that can occur and that you can measure within the 2 weeks. But whether these produce sort of lasting outcomes and whether they can be attributed to, say, if there's more plant-based food consumption or less meat consumption in France, as a result, in the future, can you say that that's a result of hosting the Olympics and the catering choices that were available at the Olympics? It's probably a difficult thing to imagine, but yeah, I mean it's possible. I think maybe there's more scope in things like sort of public infrastructure where you can certainly say, okay, infrastructure A is not available, it was more carbon intensive. Now it's only infrastructure B that was built for the Olympics, but also has a legacy use after the Olympics. Then you could probably calculate like the emissions changes that occur. But yeah, it's a good question and something we should definitely think more about, I think, going forward. You have another question? Follow-up question?
Go ahead, Barbara.
Sounds good. Yeah, I loved the explanation. And I think when you mentioned the example of the food situation in Paris, it made me think of perhaps social legacies and that can stick around after the Olympics as well. And one thing that I saw with the Paris Olympic that I hadn't seen with other Olympics was this social media, like strong storytelling that all the athletes were on TikTok and they were live streaming everything they were doing. So there was a sort of storytelling that we didn't see from other Olympics. And of course, there was a lot of criticism with the food and also with the beds, with the recycling beds that they did. But I wonder if there's a shift that could happen perhaps for the next Olympics that can influence this social aspect of legacies through, for example, social media, because it was such a big impact for me this time.
Yeah, that's very nice. Very nice to think about. Yeah, and I think social media obviously has a big role to play. The narratives that you can create. I don't know. It's great to hear your perspectives because I think the narratives. Yeah, you hear conflicting narratives as well. So in the athletes' village, there was narratives of like the food being pretty bad from some athletes, but then also I guess others were probably pretty happy, and certainly, yeah, people that I've talked to that have been to as spectators went to the games were impressed with, yeah, the food that was on offer that wasn't your typical sort of like event food, but was of kind of a higher quality and seemed a bit more nutritious and thoughtful somehow. So yeah, but yeah, that's a good point. Narratives. Who knows what social media will be using in 8 years' time though, because yeah, probably, 8 years ago or even 4 years ago, Facebook was cool. Now it's not cool. Instagram's kind of cool, but maybe TikTok is replacing Instagram. I don't know. So in 8 years, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how how social media is operates and yeah, how it's regulated as well will be really interesting to see.